What's going on, guys? Ty Reke the Tech Geek here, back again, and we got another video that's another change of pace from what we normally do here on the channel. Much like my Spigen rugged band watch band video, if you want to take a look at that, I'll leave that in the description below. But today's video is about my 1 month review on the iPhone 14 Pro. Now, I had originally filmed a unboxing and initial review of the iPhone 14 Pro. I recorded the whole thing, had the whole thing laid out, and I got a bit lazy. So here we are 1 month later, and I'm here to give you guys all my thoughts on the iPhone 14 Pro. Now, this iPhone in particular has a very special place in my heart because on release day, I was actually out in California and I went by an Apple store to pick up the iPhone 14 Pro on launch day. That's the first time I had ever gotten one on launch day. So this has a very special place in my heart. Now, upon first purchasing the iPhone 14 Pro, I really didn't think that I was going to like the actual size of the phone. It was my first 6.1 inch model iPhone. And it's actually the smallest iPhone that I've had ever since the iPhone 5S or the iPhone 4S. I really can't remember which one I had, but that's the smallest iPhone that I've had in about 10 years and the smallest phone that I've had overall in about 10 years. I've had the Samsung Galaxy S8 Plus, Note 9, Note 10. I even had the Pixel 6 Pro, and every iPhone I've had over the past couple of years have been the Pro Max variant. So getting the iPhone 14 Pro was a bit of a shock, but honestly, I think this may be Apple's best iPhone that they've ever made. And let me tell you guys why. For one, I didn't think I was gonna like the 6.1 inch size, but the actual size of the phone itself, coupled with its sturdy build material, the stainless steel borders going around the sides, and the matte finish of the phone, along with its very one-handed use case, actually made it a very, very comfortable phone to use. I really enjoy typing on it because I can actually type one-handed on it and actually hold it pretty comfortably without the need of a case. Most of the time, I find myself actually switching from my iPhone 14 Pro Max, which I'll have an unboxing review on later on, coming soon, cheap pop. But I actually tend to move from my iPhone 14 Pro Max to my iPhone 14 Pro because it is so comfortable to hold in my hand. I think the actual feel of this phone, coupled with the build material, Apple did a really good job constructing this phone, and I think I might actually go towards the Pro model variants going forward. And another thing about this phone, the new deep purple that Apple came out with this year is absolutely gorgeous. Off axis, it can kind of shift from purple to a deep blue, almost to a black if you have it in the right light, but I really think Apple did a great job with this color variant this year. Besides for the actual body of the phone, using the phone, particularly outside, has gotten a lot more enjoyable. This phone, the 14 Pro and the 14 Pro Max, are marketed for 2000 nits peak brightness outdoors, and that outdoor peak brightness actually makes this phone a whole lot easier to use during the day when I'm outside, and it doesn't really overheat as previous phones that I've used have. And the brighter, clearer display makes using this phone outdoors a whole lot more enjoyable and easier to do. 2000 nits peak brightness as compared to the 1200 peak brightness that was featured on the 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max. Using this phone outdoors is a much better experience overall. So good job from Apple on that one. Another big improvement that I saw from this phone over the 13 and 13 Pro Max over my month of using this phone has been in the camera department. The 48 megapixel main lens that Apple packed into the 14 Pro this year actually does make a really big difference when trying to take really good quality photos, either in daylight or in low light situations. It's a 65% larger lens than what was on previous iPhones, but you only really get the 48 megapixel lens when shooting in Pro RAW. So in order to show that, I'll actually show some Pro RAW photos that I took earlier. As you guys can see with the 48 megapixel camera in Pro RAW, it really brings out a lot of the raw detail that's shown in these images as opposed to something like a 12 megapixel camera. Apple phones have always displayed great computational photography, but the addition of a 48 megapixel camera really brings out the highlights and details in these photos a lot more than previous iPhones have. Even in low light situations, the iPhone 14 Pro with its new camera system has shown the ability to absolutely blow the competition out of the water and create stunning images that will leave a lasting impression on anyone who uses it. Now, unfortunately, I haven't gotten the opportunity to use a new action mode, which offers better stabilization for moving subjects, so I hope to actually use that feature coming up in the future. However, one feature I did use was a new true depth camera system that was installed on the front-facing camera with better autofocus, which gives you 2 times better photos in low light situations. I'll show you guys some images here. You can tell that a lot of the detail is still preserved and creates a natural highlight on subjects like myself in low light situations, which creates a better overall ambiance for photos that you're taking in the nighttime. Now, the new features that came packed on the 14 Pro Max weren't just reserved to the camera system. 2 brand new features that came to the phone actually ended up making quite an impression on me when I really didn't think they were going to. And one of them is the always on display. Now, when I first started using the always on display, when I first got my phone, I noticed a bit of battery drain from it. It was actually killing a lot more of my battery than I really wanted to. And I'll get the battery life in 1 second. And one constant complaint that I've heard from many tech YouTubers and many iPhone 14 Pro users is that they tend to get kind of faked out and think that the always on display is on when it really isn't. I've noticed that a couple of times, but after I've gotten used to actually using the always on display, I notice it's not as prevalent as a lot of users have probably seen. I think it's just going to take some getting used to because so many people have been used to the Android way of doing always on displays, where it's really just a black screen with icons. In particular, Samsung's way of doing always on displays, or even Pixel's way of doing always on displays, that are more minimalistic in execution. I actually tend to enjoy Apple's always on display because I can actually see the battery health of other Apple products that I'm using around myself, along with the beautiful wallpaper that I use on my iPhone, in particular me and my girlfriend, because we're cute. But I enjoy Apple's implementation of the always on display, and not just the always on display, but also the implementation of the dynamic island. Now, when I first heard about the dynamic island, my exact reaction was I really didn't know what to make of it. I thought it was just going to be another gimmick that Apple just tried to shove down our throats in order to make us shell out more money. But it actually turned out to be a really amazing feature. The actual UI tweaks that Apple uses on the dynamic island to make it such a more useful component of the iPhone experience has actually led me to not wanting to pick up my older device. I actually still have my iPhone 13 Pro Max, and it was my main device for quite some time until I got my 14 Pro Max in the mail. But whenever I would go from using my 14 Pro to my 13 Pro Max, and I would do things like go to Maps, set a timer, listen to music, I would always find myself wanting to go back to my iPhone 14 Pro, which was my secondary, just so I can use the dynamic island. It makes interacting with your apps so much less cumbersome, and actually gives you the opportunity to interact with them, make changes to whatever it is that you're doing without having to swipe back to the app that you're trying to designate. And once other apps come and actually use the dynamic island later on in the fall, I predict, or later on in some unknown time frame, such as being able to see sports scores, Lyft durations, Uber durations, stuff like that, I think that's really going to give the dynamic island a whole new use case and a much better experience for people using the iPhone 14 Pro and the Pro Max. And I think the dynamic island is a feature that we're really going to be seeing copied by a lot of other Android devices, because the dynamic island that Apple implemented on the phone, which actually took away from the atrocity that was the notch that we have gotten used to for 5 years, it makes it a whole much more seamless experience when actually using the phone. Another thing that I like about the dynamic island is that it actually takes away a lot of the unwanted interruptions that can sometimes come from using an iPhone. Like, for example, you'll see the 20% battery health indicator that can sometimes come up on iPhones that don't have the dynamic island, and it just kind of ruins your whole vibe. Like, it just kind of pops up like your little brother when you're inside your room with your girlfriend and you're just trying to have a good time, and he pops his head in like, "Hi, I'm here," and you just want to punch him in the face. The dynamic island gets rid of all that and just kind of makes it a smooth UI experience where you can see like, hey, your battery's charged, your battery is low, but it doesn't interrupt any of your content, which I really like about the iPhone 14 Pro and the Pro Max for that matter. And of course, since it's the iPhone 14 Pro, you also get the addition of the A16 chip, which upon doing my benchmarks really didn't seem to make it a really big difference in performance overall, at least in single core performance. There's only about an 8% jump from my iPhone 13 Pro Max to my 14 Pro in single core performance, but in multi-core performance, it was about a 15% jump from my iPhone 14 Pro Max to my 14 Pro. But honestly, going from the A15 to the A16 really didn't make that much of a difference. The A15 is still a very, very powerful chip. Going to the A16 probably won't make much of a difference to you, but you'll want to pick up the 14 Pro or the Pro Max if you want those better features, such as the dynamic island, the always on display, and the 48 megapixel camera. Now, during the month that I was using the 14 Pro, the one sticking point that I had at the beginning was battery life. And I think that was just because the phone was still learning how I use the phone. These phones are essentially learning computers now. That's what they do best. They take in the information from how you're using it, and they basically optimize battery life around that. At the beginning, when I started using my phone around September 16th, 18th, 17th, 19th, I really wasn't getting that good at battery life. I was getting to about mid-afternoon with about 40% left. And I really didn't like that. I think that really just came from the extra battery life that the always on display was taking away from my phone. But after about a month of using it, I think the phone has actually gotten to a point where it's been well optimized and actually has a hold on my using experience. And I can consistently get through the day with my iPhone 14 Pro with at least 50-60% battery life left. I actually conducted a battery test to see how long the battery of the iPhone 14 Pro would last, because the battery of this phone is marketed for 23 hours, so just shy of 24 hours. Now, I started my battery test at 10:30 a.m. on September 25th, so it was about 9 days after I got my iPhone 14 Pro, and started off at 100%, didn't charge it the entire time during this test, and I got all the way to about 11:50 the next night on September 26th. So a little bit more than 24 hours, right about 24, 25, 26 hours. So very good battery life that I got out of my 14 Pro. I'm hoping I can get a little bit more just because of the way that I use it. But of course, your battery life will vary depending on how you use your 14 Pro. Overall, after a month of using my iPhone 14 Pro, I can honestly say that this is honestly my favorite iPhone that Apple's ever released. Very comfortable to use in the hand, small display so I can actually reach one-handed. A bunch of new features that have made this phone possibly my favorite iPhone, or maybe even favorite phone of all time. And battery life that gets me through the day without having to worry about grabbing or reaching for a charge at any particular point. I think that the iPhone 14 Pro is the best phone that I've ever had, in my opinion, at least of the ones that I have tested. Of course, that's going to vary depending on you and your use cases. Of course, I always go for the Pro model phones, but if you're not a fan of the 48 megapixel camera, or you just want a phone with really good battery life and you don't worry about the other additional features like an always on display, like the dynamic island, go with the iPhone 14 base or the iPhone 14 Plus, because those are about $100 to $200 less than the Pro model variants. But if you want all the goodies that the iPhone 14 Pro come with, dynamic island, always on display, 48 megapixel camera, a better chip, better battery life, splash the extra $200 or $100 and pick yourself up an iPhone 14 Pro. Honestly, there's only one negative that I have for the iPhone 14 Pro, and this goes across the entire iPhone 14 lineup. Apple, off with the eSIMs. Going strictly to eSIM for the entire iPhone 14 lineup was, I think, one of the dumbest decisions that Apple has ever made. Yes, they try to say like, oh, it makes swapping from one iPhone to another one easier. You can use the extra space to go towards something else inside the phone. It gives you a cleaner design. Yeah, no. Apple did this purely to make moving from one phone to another, particularly for Android users, a whole lot more fucking hard. For example, I have a Pixel 6 Pro and I also have the new Pixel 7 Pro. I'm going to be making another video of that. Watch out for that. That I have coming in the mail. but I know for a fact I'm not going to be able to get my secondary number off my 14 Pro in order to use it to test my 7 Pro. I'm going to have to get an entirely new number, activate that, and put that into my 7 Pro, or go through the cumbersome process of getting this active SIM card on that number changed to put it inside of my 7 Pro. And then I have to go through the process of reactivating another eSIM and then putting that back into my 14 Pro. That is way too much work in order just to use a phone number. I work for a telecoms company. I can honestly tell you that trying to move numbers from one iPhone to another, even though Apple released a software tweak in iOS 16 to make that process a lot easier, it's still not completely foolproof. It's still not to the point where it's an exact science, and that's led to some situations where customers and people are waiting hours on end just for their eSIMs to activate, and it's not even guaranteed that the numbers are going to work for some time afterwards. I think Apple did it purely to make moving from other phones besides for iPhones a whole lot more difficult on the consumer, and that just was not very cash money of you, Apple. Just gonna say that. I know that in foreign markets or international markets, they still have physical SIM card trays, but I don't think that's going to be the case after a while. I think in the next year, maybe 2 years, international models are going to go strictly to eSIM as well. And that's only going to put more of a burden on international carriers to make sure they can carry and support eSIMs for people who want the latest and greatest from Apple. And I think going strictly to eSIM just made the overall experience of switching from one iPhone to another absolutely terrible. Absolutely terrible. Big negative, but one that I can live with. Overall, I love the experience with my iPhone 14 Pro. I'm going to be making an unboxing and a review video for my iPhone 14 Pro Max as well. But overall, I love the iPhone 14 Pro. Besides for the eSIM thing, I still think this is the best iPhone that Apple has made in a long time. And personally, I think it's my favorite phone of 2022 and of all time, possibly. I'll get to that on the next video, guys. But guys, this has been my 1 month review of the iPhone 14 Pro. If you or one of your family members or someone you know is looking to still pick up the iPhone 14 Pro, I'll leave some shopping links in the description below. And also don't forget to check out some carrier deals that you guys as carriers may be having on the 14 Pro, or trade-in offers directly from Apple, because that's where I got mine from. Anyway, guys, this has been Ty with the Tech Geek, my 1 month review of the iPhone 14 Pro. If you guys liked the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Later.